Welcome to the Chinwag Junkie. On today's episode, we have Senator Gerard Rennick. Please like, subscribe, share it everywhere. Find me on Facebook at the Chinwag Junkie. Find me on Instagram at the Chinwag Junkie. I am your host, Josh Stone. Let's go.
No worries. A bit like you, I'm from the Darling Downs. So I was born in Chinchilla. Had 15 years there. I actually finished my school in Toowoomba as well. Went down to UQ, did a Bachelor of Commerce, went back to Dalby for 3 years, Dalby and Chinchilla for 3 years before going overseas for what I thought would be 2 years. Ended up being 7 years, which was a good break. So came back there, came back home when I was 30, only because I felt like, I wanted to come back to Australia and didn't really want to spend my life overseas as an expat for too long. And got 3 kids as well. And I quit my job 4 or 5 years ago to have a run of politics. There were things that I discovered in my career that I felt weren't really giving Australians an even break, in particular in regards to tax breaks and things like that with international tax structuring. So I wanted to reform the Tax Act, and as well as that, I also wanted to reform the our monetary system and the way we use foreign debt, because unfortunately, between our tax system and our monetary system, we make it very easy for foreigners to come here and buy the place over. And it's not about being xenophobic or about 7 years travelling around the world. So, but obviously Australian companies can't compete if we have to pay a high rate of tax, and our government's going to use foreign debt instead of domestic equity. Then we're basically borrowing more and more money and paying interest offshore to use another country's currency. That's not really fair on behalf of the taxpayers, and it's not really leaving our children with anything in the cupboard, so to speak. Unlike our forefathers who sacrificed so much to give us so much, we need to make sure we give the same opportunities to our children. So they were the reasons why I ran. Unfortunately, a bit like yourself, my new political career was quickly sideswiped by COVID about 6-7 months in. The story of COVID, we've basically spent the last 2 and a bit years, listening about COVID statistics every day at the expense of everything else. And unfortunately, lots of small businesses, lots of people have lost their jobs. That's before the mandates, and then the mandates themselves are kicked in, and even more people have lost their jobs. People have been injured by vaccines. People are experiencing vaccine discrimination. I found myself now sort of trying to restore the civil liberties that this country once had, and I feel like the government has taken away in the last few years. So that's pretty much where we're at in a nutshell.
Yes, I would absolutely agree. So you have been one of the very few people that I have seen in Parliament. George Christensen's another one. Alex Antics, but that's I know there's others, but that's pretty much it when it comes to people in all levels of Parliament. Speaking out against the government overreach, the mandates, whether it be vaccine mandates or locking people in their own homes for what seems to be arbitrary reasons now. The mask mandates. Everyone's been saying follow the science, and then all of a sudden it didn't matter anymore. It's just do what I say and don't question it. Would you support something like a Bill of Rights to make sure that sort of thing can't happen anymore, or some sort of other legislation to strip back the CHO powers, or how would you go about that? What would you do?
That's a very good question. Technically, yes, but like all these things, pieces of paper are only good or only effective to the extent that the people who are meant to uphold those laws uphold them, right? And technically, you talk about a Bill of Rights. Well, we've got a very specific right, I would say, even in the immunisation handbook, that says you can't be coerced into taking a vaccine. Yet here we are, and people are being coerced into taking a vaccine.
Yeah.
So, it's a bit like there's talk of having a royal commission into COVID. Well, that's all good and well, but ultimately, if you don't act on that, it comes to nothing. And at the end of the day, so look, I wouldn't oppose it, but it's a means to an end and not the end in itself. And ultimately, good government is all about using common sense and being sort of productive and constructive rather than ideological and weak, which is really, where a lot of our governments have been in the last couple of years. So, and yet again, I mean, by all means, I believe in defending our rights. But after having, like there's just no substitute for having politicians that are going to stand up and do what's right. And all the documentation and all the so-called rules in the world aren't going to change that. I would have thought that we had a lot of those protections already enshrined in various bits of legislation. Another classic one's the Constitution, Section 92, that said free association between the states.
Yeah.
And yet the court used I don't know if it was a lobster or a crayfish ruling. That there's a common law case sometime in the past whereby some judge blocked crayfish or some type of seafood from crossing state borders because of a particular disease that seafood might have had, and then applied it to not directly but similar to the situation we had in the last few years. So and allowed the closure of state borders. Well, to me, that was just a very regressive act and one of the many sort of red flags to me that just said we're losing control here. I mean, look, there's an election coming up. For those of you that feel strongly about this, I suggest you signal your intent at the ballot box. But even that, like elections only come up once every 3 years federally and once every 4 years state-wise. I mean, we're stuck here in Queensland, with another 2.5 years of Palaszczuk to go. And she could get back in again, right?
That actually surprised me. The last election that we had here in Queensland, she actually had a swing towards her, which sort of blew me away. It really did. I thought she was finished. Honestly, I thought she'd done way too much damage. I thought people were. I don't like to use the waking up, but I did. I thought people were seeing through everything that we were being told, and then come the election day, it was like, no, we actually had a swing towards what she's doing.
And that's because she got up there every day for the 6 to 7 months before that election. As of all the state premiers, hour after hour, so we had one at 9, one at 10, one at 11, constantly, giving us COVID case numbers, not talking about any of the other side effects like suicides from closed businesses or, misdiagnosis from cancer or whatever. So it was all about COVID. And even now they're trying to beat the COVID drum. But going back to that time, another red flag was even when we had no cases, they'd get up there every day and say, we've got 0 cases. And then they'd look for something to scare us with. So we went through the old COVID in the sewage stage there for a while. And you're just like, well, what are they running around testing sewage for COVID? I mean, and if anything, didn't that prove that if COVID's in the sewage, people must have had COVID and didn't even know it?
Yeah. That's what it suggests to me, but, I know. I could be wrong.
So back to your initial question about Bill of Rights, all that stuff's obviously good. I'm not against it, but at the same time as well, there's no substitute for having politics stand up and do what's right, and use some common sense and have some convictions. When they can see that wrong things are being done.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it only takes the wrong sort of government, and it's only a piece of paper at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
I mean, better than nothing, and it's got and it is something to have a platform to argue against. But they talk about science, right? I mean, and this stuff's starting to come out now. But the spike protein from the vaccine is not the same spike protein from the virus. They have modified the spike protein from the vaccine so much to evade the immune system, the innate immune system, to be more, create more spike proteins to last longer in the body. Mm-hmm. It's not a de-attenuated vaccine at all. Normally, a vaccine de-attenuates the toxic part of the virus and gives you a weaker dose in theory. Well, that's how the theory works, right?
Yeah.
But this particular vaccine is a much stronger dose. So, and yet that's just been totally overlooked it's like I said, it's starting to get a bit of traction now again in social media. Just what we were told we were going to be given. Not that I got the vaccine, but isn't what actually you were given. So just another lie. Just another example of dishonesty that's been going on.
So speaking of the social media, people sort of coming to realization, I've noticed it on a hell of a lot of pages, news pages, even Scott Morrison's page, the Premier Palaszczuk's page, all of them. You go back, about a year or maybe a little bit over, and everyone was like in support of everything that they were saying. And then as it's gone on, you can watch it. It's like a timeline. And I realize it's social media and it's not accurate by any means, but you can see all the little emojis change, and you can see the comments change, and people are starting to say, we're over it. This isn't working anymore. I've already had it. It wasn't that bad. That's a common one that I'm seeing. A very common one that I'm seeing is it wasn't as bad as everyone made out of. Maybe 2 years ago with the original variant, it may have been. Same with the vaccine. Maybe it was bloody effective against the original variant, but by the time Delta rolled around, a lot of people were saying, like educated people were saying, this isn't very effective against even Delta, and now we're into Omicron, and it's we're still going down this path where I know Queensland has recently dropped most of their mandates and restrictions for getting into pubs and clubs and that sort of thing, but it wasn't very long ago that happened, and people were still being, like you said, coerced into getting this so they could live a normal social life. That sort of overreach, it drove me up the wall. I couldn't believe that I was living through something like that. It completely blew me. It still does. It blows me away thinking about what we've been through for the last 2 years and still trying to claw ourselves out of. Government being in our lives. It's
totally agree. I'll touch on a couple of points there.
Sure.
I agree with you. The mood has changed. And you're right. Like, okay, social media is not necessarily a perfect indicator of what's going on in the community, but it is a barometer.
Sure.
And there is some correlation. And you're right. The emojis have changed from, thumbs up, yep, we support what the government's doing now, to cynicism and anger. And you can see that when the mainstream media, posts their, here's another fear story about COVID. It's the smiley face with the sarcastic emoji on it. That usually leads the way now, followed by an angry one, or the combination of those two outweigh the thumbs up. So and like you say, because I think a lot of people have had COVID now, and it might have been hard while you had it for a couple of days, but most people, as I've always maintained, most healthy people and working age population will survive COVID.
Yeah, sure.
And so why on earth have we locked down the working age population who've had least risk of getting it in order to protect, the more vulnerable? And by all means, we should protect the vulnerable, but you don't do that by destroying the strong. So things have changed there, and that's good. In regards to the restrictions, yep, sure, they've relaxed restrictions now on going to the pub and things like that, but effectively many people still can't work unless you're vaccinated. Yeah, and the government are backsliding into employees now can set these mandates, right? These work assessments that these risk assessments that these employees are undertaking are completely false and misleading. They're not taking into account vaccine injuries. They're not taking into account the fact that the vaccine is not fit for purpose. And they're not putting a timeline on the vaccine duration, because at the end of the day, and this is my fear, what we don't want to happen here is have COVID go off the front pages, but the regulations stay. We don't want to have the situation now where every time you've got to get a job, you've got to be vaccinated for the most recent flu. And it's got to be with an mRNA vaccine that, quite frankly, the more we find out about, is actually, quite dangerous. And the side effects are completely unknown. To have employed, and this is the thing, vaccine injuries don't check in at 9 and check out at, clock off at 5. I mean, you live with a vaccine injury and you live with the risk of that vaccine for, the rest of your life. And look, I accept that 95% of people who get the vaccine probably don't have side effects, but there's probably you can pick a number here, somewhere between 1% to 5%. From what I can tell, it's a bit hard to tell, as you probably know, because there's so much censorship of vaccine injuries. It's hard to get a true measure of how many people are injured, but it's probably fair to say somewhere between 1% to 5%. I mean, even 1 in 100 is too high. If your benchmark for a vaccine or any type of drug should be less than 1 in a million in terms of serious injury, right? If that, I mean, really, it's do no harm. So
yeah,
that's too high. But
and when you take into consideration that government officials or government bodies are telling you have to have it, you have to. That's taking all choice away. No matter how you look at it, that's not a choice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, forget the fact that it's not even fit for purpose and it's not safe. I mean, it's still your body. You should be able to have the choice of what goes into your body, right? But that's
punishing people for making the wrong choice isn't a choice either.
What's that? Sorry.
Punishing people for making the wrong choice. There's always been that narrative that you don't have to have it. We're not forcing you to have it. You just lose your job and you can't go to a cafe. You can't go out with friends. You can't go do great many things. So you're getting punished for making the wrong choice. That's not. That's not how this free exchange is meant to work.
Yeah. So we've got to then, and this is sort of what I'd like to do. I'm not really having much luck, I'll be honest, is we've got to stop the regulations, but then not only that, we have to bury the regulations so they never come back again, because my fear is that they're going to, now that they've done it once, they'll do it again. And the last part is we can't let the narrative be that they've saved lives, because I'm not convinced that they have saved lives out of what they've done. I think they've done much more damage, more harm than good. And if the narrative comes out of this, and no doubt this is what the governments and the mainstream media will be doing, is that they, and look at us, we protected you, we looked after you, like, Palaszczuk always says, we were keeping you safe. Okay, they will then use that narrative to justify doing this again. And we've already had the Chief Health Officer here in Queensland say, we don't want to get rid of everything just yet, because if we want to bring it back, we need to bring it back quickly. We want to be able to bring it back quickly. Why are you even thinking about bringing it back quickly? The fact that they even sort of have that mindset suggests to me that they're just, waiting for the moment to jump again and lock us all down or terrify us again. So, it's got to stop the regulations, bury the regulations, as in can't come back again. And number three is to make sure that the narrative isn't that the government saved the day.
Yes, for sure. Completely agree.
Yeah.
I'm right there with you on all of that. Speaking of vaccine injuries, you brought those up. I think it's really, it's very strange. It's also very disgusting. So in one story, if you watch news on TV, not that I have for a long time, but if you watch news on TV, the story is that the vaccine injury insurance, I guess you could call it, from the government, it got upped to lowered to $2,000 worth of hospital bills and all that sort of stuff. And on the next story on mainstream media is that vaccine injuries are so rare. Why are we even having these things? It's like they're contradicting themselves in the same breath. Even everyone that says that they're suffering from some sort of adverse reaction gets called to their face a conspiracy theorist. I've seen it on social media. People are mocking people for saying that they pericarditis or going to hospital and complaining that the quality of care is take a Panadol, it's just anxiety. It's like, what's going on there? That we've got this system in place to sort of deal with the vaccine injured, and on the other hand, it's getting played off as a conspiracy. It's like, how does that work? on what planet are we living where those two things can live side by side?
Oh, look, that often happens in many respects. You know, there's lots of, we say one thing and do another that goes on in the world. Look, the thing about the vaccine injuries is if proper attention was given to the vaccine injuries, it would quickly become apparent that the vaccine isn't fit for purpose, and it's actually doing more harm than good. So that's why the media don't want to talk about it. I mean, the media have been pumping it up now: get your vaccine, get jabbed, and all this stuff. And now, people should be held liable for misleading people. I mean, we've been told so many times these vaccines are safe and effective, that if they ran the story about vaccine injuries, and that's why they're now talking about long COVID. Now, I'm sure long COVID does exist. Post-viral symptoms are real. I mean, people in the past have got influenza, long before COVID, and they don't always recover as well as they should. People are vulnerable to post-viral syndromes, whatever they may be.
Yeah.
But they're trying to rebrand everything now under long COVID, including vaccine injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's because they want to blame it on COVID and not the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and if they do that, then they can justify rolling out even more vaccines, which is very unfortunate. And the problem with this long COVID is now, while I think it was always real, is that a lot of people who get COVID after they've had their 2 shots or 3 shots, is it the vaccine or is it COVID that's actually caused the injury as well? So that is going to become another issue that is going to be difficult to separate. And I suspect in many cases it's actually the vaccine, and not necessarily, you might have had 2 shots and recovered or been okay, but that 3rd shot of COVID, because effectively the vaccine is the virus, right? And it's not attenuated, as I just said before.
Mm-hmm.
So if you then get a 3rd dose of it via the real virus, then that might be the 3rd dose that triggers your body. So some people get the 3rd boost, get first 2 shots, get a booster, and that it's the booster that gives them the injury, right? Well, if they get 2 shots and then the virus, it might be the virus that gives them the injury because the spike proteins, do the damage. So,
and that's something that's been played down in the corporate press and whatnot. You see memes about it even all the time. I've had my 2 shots and my booster, and I still caught COVID, but I'm glad that I got it because it would have been so much worse. That is the most unscientific thing I've ever heard in my life. It's laughable. Obviously, it's been made into a meme, and this gets parroted all the time.
Yeah.
I've heard people say it, like in real life. Heard people say that I'm glad I was vaccinated because it could have been so much worse. It's like, no. What about all the people that caught the original variant before the vaccine was even thought of? It could have been, obviously that was going to be worse than this Omicron that's getting around at the moment, but they didn't even have an option of having any sort of vaccine. They didn't know how to deal with it even.
Yeah, that's right. And even with those stronger versions earlier on, I mean, the majority of people still survived, and the average age, people passed away from it was still over 80. And look, I mean, I had COVID for 2 days. I was unvaccinated and I got over it. So for people to say that, well, if I didn't have the vaccine, it could have been, there's no justification, because they're ignoring their own immune system, which if you're fit and healthy, it's highly likely that you would have got through it anyway. So I mean, and that's another lie, or diversion from the truth, if you want to call it that, about how they sort of tried to ignore natural immunity in all of this as well. And even in the Pfizer trial, they completely ignored the impacts of natural immunity. When they did the trial, they didn't actually separate the participants between those who already had COVID and would have antibodies, and those who didn't have COVID, because that in itself would have had an impact. Because if you had COVID, recovered, and then they gave you the vaccine, then was it the vaccine for the reason why you didn't get COVID, or the antibody, natural antibody? So they needed to know that, because really, if you wanted to test the vaccine properly, they should have done it on people who didn't have COVID, but they didn't separate that out at all.
Yeah. So given your background, so the effects on the economy, due to lockdowns, due to mandates, due to restrictions, all the rest of it. How long do you think that's going to take before it presents itself in the form of inflation? I know we've seen a lot of businesses already shutting down, but I mean, I don't think the worst has come yet. I think it's still on its way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the worst is on its way if they lift interest rates and don't do anything else, because a lot of people took on debt, and I mean, COVID's going to accentuate what was already a problem, and that is our mismanagement of our monetary system.
Yes.
For the last 40 years, the RBA have basically tried to control the economy via qualitative easing, which is known as adjusting the interest rate.
Mm-hmm.
And they have never done anything about quantitative easing, which is where you basically deal with the volume of money in the system or the volume of credit in the system. What the RBA has done is if you wanted more credit, you would go offshore and you would borrow money from offshore rather than print money here. Now, one of the things you told me, I did a Bachelor of Commerce at UQ, I did accounting since, business principles since grade 9. I've basically been inside a book, accounting book for most of my life. One of the things you're told very early on is that you can't print money. That is a complete load of rubbish, right? All money is printed. Okay, all money comes out of thin air, right? Money is a game of, charades, I guess is another way of calling it. But I'll explain it to you. If you wanted to build a dam in this country, if you're the government and you wanted to build a dam, let's say it cost $1 billion. If you went and borrowed $1 billion from offshore to build that dam, the first $1 billion of wealth you created from that dam, you have to repay offshore. Yep. And let's say it took you 25 years at 4% to repay that debt. That's another 100% interest, another $1 billion of interest you have to repay offshore. So that means we've just lost the first $2 billion of wealth we created from building that dam. Now, what's the biggest market in the world? Do you know what it is?
Probably steel, something like that. Oil, maybe? No? Water?
You're thinking the right way because you're thinking physical commodities, but it's actually, and oil is the biggest physical commodity market in the world. But of course, there's then what you call the synthetic market, which of course is paper. And the biggest market in the world is, of course, the US dollar. And the US dollar, you know where the US dollar comes from?
No, actually.
It comes from the printing press.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
Yep. So basically, that's the power of being the strongest country in the world. It's your currency that becomes, your everything is denominated in your currency, and then you go around the world supposedly, lifting people out of poverty. And to an extent, that's true, by the way. I don't want to say that you don't. But when you lend someone else, if you're a sovereign country and you borrow foreign dollars, as I just explained, you're sending yourself broke, right? So every sovereign country should print its own money, right? And should fund, this is the important part, right? Should fund its own productive capacity. So what you have to do, and we've got $1 trillion in debt now, is to basically, rather than borrow and spend, which is what we do. So imagine if you finished school and you went out and borrowed $50,000 and then you just went on a Kentucky holiday overseas and drank it away, you'd end up with $50,000 debt. You've got nothing productive to show for it, right? Yes. What you have to do is build and print. All right, so let's go. I'll talk about Nathan Dam because you'll know where that is. It's on just north of Miles there as you go driving out to Roma. Yep. That's a dam that could dam the Dawson, do a lot of things. If you wanted to build that dam, hang on, I've lost my train of thought there. By building that dam, now the other thing is people always say printing money creates inflation, right? That's not true. If you print and build or build and print, what you do is if you put more water into the system, you'll increase the supply of water, you'll push the cost of water down. If you actually build more power plants and energy, you'll actually push the cost of energy down, right? Likewise with roads or airports or whatever, you're actually increasing supply. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So what the RBA has been doing for the last 30 or 40 years, by manipulating interest rates, they manipulate asset prices, but they're not creating anything, right? If you went to a desert island, would you either A, go to the bank, or B, look to create control the means of production? You'd look to control the means of production.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I know this is oversimplified, but you've got to strip it.
Sure. Back, right? Definitely.
Yeah.
I appreciate
because there is no bank on a desert island, right? Like suddenly all those bankers waffling around in pinstripe suits, if you've all got on a ship and cruise ship and you're all sunk, those pinstripe bankers would, you swam ashore. Those pinstripe bankers would be useless. There's all paper shufflers would be useless. It's guys like yourself, like electricians and that, can actually do stuff that you need, right? So that's what we've got to get back to, is being productive rather than speculative. Now, we've got an example. That's actually happened. Do you know the first guy who actually print money in Australia was?
No.
Lachlan Macquarie. So have you heard of Lachlan Macquarie?
Lachlan Macquarie. I am.
And the Holy
too.
Yeah. So the first 7 years in modern Australia, basically they relied on foreign currency or a barter system. And there was a drought in 1805. So any foreign currency got repatriated and they started bartering rum, hence the Rum Rebellion, right?
Yeah.
Of course, as you well know, the problem with rum is you end up drinking it, right? So that didn't last very long, or, it all literally went up, proverbial upwards. So Lachlan Macquarie was the first governor to see Australia as a country, not a colony. And if you want to control your country, have country, you've got to have a military to defend your borders and provide law and order, a taxation system, and a monetary system. So Lachlan Macquarie introduced the monetary system. It was called the Holy Dollar. And he got these Spanish pesos or whatever, punched a hole in the middle of them. The middle of them was called the dump. And the outside part of the dollar was called the Holy Dollar. Hence why it's called HOLEY, the Holy Dollar. Now, who uses that Holy Dollar as its logo today?
I don't know.
Macquarie Bank.
The Macquarie Bank?
You ever heard of Macquarie Bank?
I have, yes.
Yeah. They're called the Millionaires Factory. And their business model is to basically operate a lot of infrastructure or manage a lot of infrastructure on behalf of super funds and everything like that. But that infrastructure was once owned by us. So what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years, much of our infrastructure has been privatised into the hands of superannuation funds, which is another jip. So if you think Pfizer and these drug companies have been screwing you over these vaccines, we've been getting screwed by banks and neoliberalism for much longer. But the sale of infrastructure was one of the biggest mistakes that was ever made across the Western world, because infrastructure, you take, like I'm down here in Brisbane, you take those tunnels on the way to the airport and everything like that. Today, Brisbane's a city of 2 million people and you pay $5 for the tunnel. In 100 years' time, Brisbane will have 5 million people and you'll be paying $50 for the tunnel, right? Like the power of if you own government, the best way for a government to hedge against inflation is to control its own infrastructure. And as we saw when, Sir Joe became Premier in the late 50s, what he did to turn, Queensland was broke then, by the way. What he and his treasurer, Leo Hilscher, did was to actually go and build things, right? So they went and opened up the Bowen Basin, the coal deposits, the alumina bauxite deposits up in North Queensland. They built railway lines to get that coal exported out. They built power stations, a la Toowong Energy. Built lots of dams to, create irrigation, especially up there in the Burdekin. And then interestingly enough, when I first became a senator, Leo Hilscher was one of the first guys I went to see. But they, unfortunately, because you're a state, governments can't print money. He borrowed money at 8%, but he repaid it all in 10 years. So they generated 180% return in 10 years. I mean, that's how much, if you build that, you're well managed and you build infrastructure, that's how quickly you can generate a return. And that's what we have to do. We have to stop shuffling paper in this country and we have to start building again. Just strip it right back to, imagine if you're on a desert island, how do you survive? And we have to do that. And the beauty of it is...
Sorry, but it goes back to the people that are in government. The people have to, the officials, they have to be responsible to do that. And we haven't seen. I know you've been alluding to it, but we haven't seen that for a long time. We haven't seen government spending dollars responsibly at any level for since Howard, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, we actually, I say we, the LNP coalition, almost got back to balanced budget the year we got back in, and then COVID just blew it apart. And what's particularly frustrating is the RBA were happy to print $5 billion a week to shut the economy down, but now they've stopped the money printing, when really they ought to keep the money printing going on the condition that it is secured against infrastructure. So basically, I don't know how much counting but your debit asset, credit, equity. Right, we shouldn't be continuing to borrow money offshore, because we're going to end up in trouble if most of that foreign debt's foreign, and we have to pay 3 or 4% from 1%. Every 1% increase in interest rates is going to cost us $10 billion more. each year in interest. So that's really, really going to hurt. So do we need to control spending? Absolutely. But we also need to look at new ways of, I guess, generating income that's not going to increase taxes. And that's the beauty. If you go back and own your own infrastructure, as I just pointed out with those airports, for example, the best way to generate your revenues is to actually own that infrastructure and not allow super funds or foreigners to own the infrastructure, because they're gouging us, right? When the Port of Newcastle, for example, was sold about a decade ago, they stuck up stevedoring. I mean, Port of Newcastle is a monopoly effectively. I mean, there's only one place the coal in the Hunter Valley goes out, and that's via the Newcastle port. They stuck up stevedoring fees by 60% in the first 9 months. And I think Macquarie had a hand in that as well. I'll stand to be corrected, but I think they owned a bit of that as well. So that's what these fund managers do, right? Yet again, the paper shufflers, have so much power. So anyway, that's my take on the economy. Then we've got. I'll just give you another thing we have to do as well, and that is fix up our multinational tax structure, whereby we have withholding tax rates on interest, royalties, and rent of between 0 and 15%, depending on country and depending on treaty. What that means is that these multinationals can pay interest, royalties, rent, licensing fees, whatever they can, whatever they can transfer off to their head office in some form of expense. And depending on tax treaty, they may, let's just say it's 0, for example, in some extreme cases, they'll get a tax deduction of 30 cents in a dollar. So let's say BHP makes $100 here, and when they've shut them down now, the ATO cracked down on it, but they had marketing hubs in Singapore, as if Singapore needed to market iron ore, right? Singapore has no iron ore, right? The idea that they were doing that out of Singapore was ludicrous, right? But let's say Singapore BHP made $100 here, they'd pay $30 company tax. If they would then just go, okay, let's try and ship profits offshore, we'll pay $100 in marketing fees to Singapore, get a $100 tax deduction here. We lose, the country loses $30 in company tax. We lose the marketing employee who would have paid PAYG, and we lose $100 in capital to boot, right? So, and the reason why that happens is that in Australia, we have a company tax rate of 30 cents and then a withholding tax rate of between 0 and 15. So there's an arbitrage or a difference between claiming it as an expense here and then what you pay in withholding tax on the way out. So we're incentivizing shipping profits offshore. So what we've got to do is lift withholding tax rates up so that we don't basically make it so easy to ship profits offshore. And not just, it's easy to do it, but actually incentivized by giving them money to actually ship those profits offshore. So that's the other thing as well. And that's why Australian companies can't compete against the multinational, because a multinational can always structure their tax act or their taxes so that they pay less taxes. And if they pay less taxes, they've got a competitive advantage in pricing. And then they can undercut the Australian business, if not end up taking it over. So anyway, so that's another aspect I'd like to work with, but unfortunately,
overhaul the tax system.
What's that? Sorry.
Overhaul the tax system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sounds good to me. So what about super? You mentioned that before. Do you think it's a good thing? Do you see it as a good thing? Do you
no,
think there should be?
No, I'd let the workers keep their 10% of wages. So basically, my view is we want to empower people as much as possible. We don't want to disempower them. For a lot of people who earn, between $50,000 to $100,000 a year, by the time they pay taxes and their cost of living, they have next to no money left anyway. But let's just say that they earned $100,000 and they had $10,000 left over. That last 10% of their income is then going to go to somebody in Sydney or Melbourne in some ivory palace until these people they turn 60, and there's no guarantee they'll ever get the money back. So, yet again, New Zealand, for example, had a referendum in the late 90s on whether or not superannuation should be compulsory, and they voted against it 92% to 8. Do you really think, if Paul Keating had said to people in 1992, by 2021, we're going to take 10% of your income and give it to someone you've never met until you're 60, and there's no guarantee you're going to get that money back, do you think people would have voted for it?
Yeah, no.
Absolutely.
No chance.
No. And we've got that already scheduled to increase to 12%, and Labor want to take it to 15%. So exactly by the time you pay your 25 cents in the dollar of taxes, you lose another 15 cents in super. I mean, you get that back when you're 60 if you get it back, but I mean, you got a lifetime of fees and stuff coming out of it. What are people meant to live on? I mean, it's all right if you're wealthy and over 100 grand, say earning a higher income above $100,000, you probably can get some tax breaks out of super. But for the low income to medium income earners, it doesn't help them at all. It actually makes it, harder for them throughout their working age to get by. And what people have to understand here is there's $40 billion a year wasted in fees on superannuation.
40 billion?
Yeah, and paper shuffling and clipping the ticket on, so you'll get your super fund, put money into a super fund, and they'll charge you so much a year. The super fund will then get like a fund manager to manage, buy an asset that the fund manager might manage. They'll have advisors telling them what to do. They'll have proxy advisors that are telling them how to vote. And then those fund managers will use a share broker to buy the shares, or they'll have particular analysts. They'll pay analysts to tell them what to do or how to manage the assets. So all of this money gets chewed up in paper shuffling. None of it's productive, right? But on top of that, that's in fees. There's $40 billion in tax concessions that go to the top 10 or 20% of income earners. Now, they're the very people who aren't going to need a pension. I mean, I'm one of those people, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I shouldn't be getting a tax concession in my superannuation because I don't need it, right? I mean, it should be helped. So we're much better off increasing the pension and making and lifting the thresholds so that people on the lower incomes are helped more. But then it gets even worse. Of the $3 trillion in super in Australia, $1 trillion is invested offshore.
Yep. I have this before. Yep.
Yeah. So yet again, why aren't they building assets here? But they don't want to build assets here because they already own a lot of the infrastructure assets here, or in partnership with foreign investments and wealth funds, right? And if you build, so for example, Sydney Airport's a classic case, right? Mm-hmm. Is that there's been a lot of antagonism against building the Western Sydney Airport, and a lot of that's been fed by the super funds and the people who own the Sydney Airport, because the Western Sydney Airport will take away the monopoly of the Sydney Airport, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got our own super funds working against us in building more infrastructure, right? And this is the problem with super funds. They only buy, they don't build. Mm. Remember, they're the paper shufflers. These people aren't engineers or electricians, right? They're just paper shufflers sitting there drinking their coffee and getting their muffin and maybe going down and getting a massage at lunchtime after they had did their triathlon on the weekend, right? And I've been there, done all that, so I'm not, so I've seen how the system works. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the true battlers out there, the farmers and the electricians and the mechanics actually, being productive, right? They're getting taxed from above 18,200.
Yeah.
So you start paying 19 cents in the dollar above 18,200, and you could be a multi-millionaire and only pay 15 cents in your super fund.
Yeah, that's not right.
No, that's right. I mean, it's not means tested. I mean, by all means, I'm not against encouraging people to save for their retirement, but it's this centralisation of money that then, and this is one of the reasons why you're now seeing companies like Woolworths and Telstra and all of that bringing mandates in very late, even well after the fact that that the Omicron's become endemic rather than pandemic, is that all these decisions have taken months to flow down from the fund managers through the super industry funds or the bank funds or whatever into the boardrooms, then down into management, right? And it's taken months. But the problem with superannuation is that you get, it's superannuation funds are often controlled by ideologists like unions, etc.
Yes.
And so they're pushing ideology rather than productivity. Right. And then you've got the obvious ones that a lot of your listeners would know, like BlackRock and Vanguard in the States. They own shares, I think, in BHP, and I think they own shares in Woolworths and things like that. But they also own shares in Pfizer and, NBN or whatever in the media company. So that you've got a very centralised form of decision making. Mm-hmm. And you only need to own 5 or 10% of the actual company to have a lot of say, right? It's a bit like with these mandates. If you could ask most people whether or not they wanted mandates now, most of them would probably say no. But, sure, everyone's voice is splintered, right? A good example is Woolworths. I've been contacted by so many people from Woolworths about these mandates, and I keep saying you've got to talk to your colleagues and get a group of people together to really form a class action against Woolworths, because there's not a lot of labour going around in Australia at the moment. So if you've got, a couple of thousand Woolworths employees to go, right, you sack us and in a couple of thousand, even people who did get vaccinated all stand together, they could really cause a lot of heartache for Woolworths, right? But it's very hard to do that. So, it's once that control, and not only that too, like the directors of companies, it's a small club, right? So even if they didn't know that, Vanguard or BlackRock might own 10% of a company together, they'll get their mates from, who they know think alike on those boards, right? And the board director gets paid 150 grand to turn up to a couple of meetings a year. So it becomes very easy to control everything, because at the end of the day, right, if I'm at a protest and there's 10,000 people at a protest, but I'm a guy in a bulldozer, a D10 with the keys, right? I mean, do you know what I mean? It's the people who hold the keys that have the power.
Yes.
In many ways, it's a bit like, and this is my job as a senator, because I do have access to some of these ministers, albeit they don't listen to me, which is why I need to get the public behind me, and I need to get the ministers to realise the public behind me. But it's like, we're trying to crack open a safe with a 4x2, right? But you really need to be able to, put your ear up against the safe itself and unlock it that way. And so getting back to the superannuation thing again, your initial question was, we don't want to centralise too much power, whether it be wealth or health choices or childcare and things like that. We shouldn't be paying people on the condition that they put their kids into institutionalised childcare centres, right? We should allow the parents to choose what type of childcare they have. If you want to, not put your child in childcare and let your grandparents look after them, and it's a bit more money for the family, then so be it. Or you might want the nanny to come to your house, or you might be a policeman or a nurse who works shift hours and your late shift might finish at 10 o'clock at night. Childcare's no good to you, right? So you want that nanny for the last 4 hours between, say, 7 and 11 o'clock or 6 and 10 o'clock, right? But yet again, everything's designed to centralise power in the hands of the bureaucrats and what I call the elites or the blowhards, so to speak. And we've got to push back against that and try and empower the individual as much as possible, because true democracy comes from the grassroots. It doesn't come from centralised decision making.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I like that. I really did like that. That was excellent. So seeing I only had you for an hour, I might wrap it up there because I've got 10 minutes.
That's very joy.
That's all right. So thanks for coming on. Where can we find you? You got Facebook page?
Facebook. Google's type my name in Senator Gerard Rennick. You might have to type it in once or twice because I think I'm shadow banned. So I've quite often had people say to me, "Oh, I can't find you," and I'll say, "Oh, look, type my name in twice or three times and I'll come up." But mainly Facebook is what I use. I'm on Instagram a bit as well and a bit of Telegram. But I just literally don't have time to use 4 or 5 different social media. It'd be good if I could. But I do get my copy of what I put on Facebook. But Facebook, it's pretty much me. And pretty much at the moment, if you look at the last 6 months of posts, it's pretty much unfortunately all about these vaccine mandates. But if you go back before that, I do talk a lot more about monetary policy, the science, thermodynamics, and the science behind climate change, and a few other issues like that.
Yeah, right. Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming.
No worries.
Hopefully
no worries,
we'll talk to you soon.
Cheers. Okay.
All right.